Hi, Landon Thomas, New York Times Study Day.
Hi, Landon. Nice to see you.
Okay, so we're going to run for 29, 30 minutes, and we'll tell you when the time's up.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, shall we go? We're here tonight to talk to David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary, about the upcoming meeting in London. Can I start by asking you, Foreign Secretary, what is your hopes from the April summit?
I think there are two tasks that the Prime Minister has set for the London summit on the 2nd of April. The first is to take forward the key questions that were raised on the global financial system at the Washington summit in November. 47 tasks were set by the leaders of the G20 to make changes to the global financial system. But I think there's a second task, which is evident in the title of the summit, which goes beyond financial issues to look at jobs and growth. And that challenge is to bring leaders together to develop a response, a systemic response, adequate to the scale of the economic crisis that we face, not just the financial crisis. The economic crisis born on the one hand of the credit crunch, obviously, but also of the resource crunch that last year saw oil prices reach $147 a barrel. And that's why the agenda of the summit is about financial regulation, but it also extends to macroeconomic coordination, to key issues about international trade, to how we protect developing countries and a development agenda, and also how we plan for a sustainable recovery, especially a low-carbon recovery that doesn't repeat the mistakes that in some ways contributed to the resource crunch of last year. So there's a short-term agenda where confidence needs to be given to people around the world that some basic issues are being addressed, but there's also a longer-term agenda. And again, confidence is at the heart of it. Global leaders representing 75% of global GDP, showing that they are up to the challenge that's posed by this global economic crisis.
Kimiko Aoki from Japan Broadcasting Bureau Chief and Chief Correspondent. The G20 summit is different from G7, G8. In what way, and how would you show that you are including these countries, the G20 countries, in decision-making, especially if you were to take example the financial system, voting powers in the IMF, veto power of the America, these things, that would you be able to show concrete steps that not for just this occasion, but for the future?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a really important point because the phrase of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, comes to mind. For some time, we've all known that economic power has shifted from west to east. But that shift of economic power hasn't been reflected in many of the multilateral institutions that were developed after the Second World War. And in the case of what is now the G8 in the 1970s. And that's why you've got the G8 plus 5. But the plus 5 feels like too much of an afterthought, not really an attempt to come to grips with where power lies in the world. I think the significant thing about the G20 is its inclusiveness. 75% of global GDP, China, India sitting at the table. And you're absolutely right that key issues of representation are raised by those countries, rightly in our view, about existing institutions. The Financial Stability Forum doesn't have a seat for China. The IMF has 3.5% of its voting weight for China. Those are issues those issues of representation, political representation, do need to be addressed, and I think that it's very much our intention that they're on the table for the summit.
Could I just add a question from one of our website viewers who says, this is Sally, who says, only a tenth of the world's countries are attending the summit. How come such a small proportion can take binding decisions for the world? Why don't you have some of the poorer countries there?
Well, I think it's a good point, and certainly one of our responsibilities is to reach out to all four corners of the world, north, east, south, and west, to reach out to ensure that a range of representation. I spoke to the South African Foreign Minister today and was speaking to her again later this week about the importance of representation for developing countries. But the truth about the modern interdependent economic world is that a crisis that is a crisis in the industrialized world and the financial system infects the economic possibilities of the developing world as well. And so this has to be an inclusive process, not just in its representation, but critically in its impact and effect. And I think that today you can honestly say that bringing stability to the financial markets of some of the most advanced countries is absolutely critical to prosperity for people, hundreds of millions of people living on less than $1 a day in the developing world. And that's why the agenda of the summit avowedly includes our commitments to the developing world.
Johannes.
Johannes Leithauser, I'm reporting for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. But bringing in more countries and different countries will, of course, be not enough. They have to come to common conclusions then, which makes the thing even more harder. And when you look within the developed world in preparation of this summit in London, even there are still frictions and different approaches to what should be achieved in April in London. For instance, the German Chancellor is talking about a new economic council, World Economic Council. That sounds different than the thing the British Prime Minister talks about, saying he wants a charter of new economic principles. Principles are more easy to agree on than sort of an institution that would have to enforce them afterwards.
Well, you're right. This is an agenda that does need to bring people together. You'll know that even within the European Union, we have our own structures to try to ensure that there is a coherent European response. I think that you need principles and you need institutions. So I don't think that the dichotomy that's suggested between those two is quite as strong as you suggest. But you're right. This crisis has enveloped the global economy, and leaders are having to make decisions about their own national economic response. But the founding principle that the Prime Minister here has emphasized is that international economic policy is domestic international policy these days, because the international dimensions of economic policy are so strong. And so whether it be on the regulatory agenda or the macroeconomic agenda or the trade agenda, the international agenda crowds in on your domestic options. And you're right to say that there's a lot of political legwork that needs to be done, but I think that's what people expect, because they have a very strong sense around the world that the old economic recipes and the old economic institutions need reform. And I think not to respond to that for fear that all the answers wouldn't be found straight away would be a real abdication of responsibility. What I think is on the table is the chance to find agreement beyond the lowest common denominator. And that means everyone recognizing that they have more to gain from cooperation than they do to lose from mucking in.
Thanks, Mr. Miliband. Landon Thomas for the New York Times here in London. If you had to write the headline for what this summit would accomplish in your sort of best possible world, what would it be?
Foreign Office has beautiful writing, but isn't always the best at headline.
Just what, with regard to the accomplishment, like if you had to say that here's what has been accomplished.
Well, this has
because I guess that's always a certain, when you have these big conglomerations of countries, especially in such a critical time, differences everywhere, protection worries in the U.S., perhaps exchange rate worries in China, differences in France, and with regard to how economic plans are being conducted here versus other countries in Europe. Bringing everyone together, what would you wish?
Well, the most important word,
ideally, like a concrete development that someone could say, "Wow, this is a unique."
I mean, the most important word is obviously agreement. That's what you need. The most important word to come out of it. But I do think it's important to emphasise the short term. There is a short-term response to the global financial crisis, and the 47 issues that were raised by the Washington summit are very practical and very real, and they speak to issues of regulation, issues of representation, and they need
setting up a new body. Perhaps,
well, I mean, the issue that was raised about the Financial Stability Forum, very practical point. Those are representational issues, but there are also regulatory issues. There are issues. Britain has argued for a college of supervisors, so that there is proper alignment of different financial regulatory systems around the world. There are a set of issues that need to be addressed that go to the heart of the financial crisis that has enveloped the world over the last 6 to 9 months. But then there is a broader agenda, and that is where this body, which is not a legal body, you're right, this isn't the United Nations, it's not a treaty writing body, but it is a body of sovereign governments representing 3/4 of the world's GDP coming to an agreement, hopefully, on some key issues about macroeconomic coordination, about financial regulation, about trade and resistance to protectionism, about the development agenda, which I do think is important to emphasize. And also, in the year of the Copenhagen Climate Conference, this is not a meeting that will do the work of the Copenhagen UN negotiations for it, but it needs to send a very clear signal that if we don't have a low-carbon recovery or a lower carbon recovery, then we won't have a sustainable recovery. And so I think those are areas where you'll have a mix of great specificity and great ideals and objectives. Both are important.
Could I ask you a question that one of our USC subscribers put to us? So he's called Stoop to Conquer, and he says, the government is championing a halt to protectionism. Is there any evidence that this is what people actually want? If I was a car worker, I might want a bit more, not a bit less protectionism.
Well, but if you're a car worker, you depend on exports. I mean, near my constituency, the Nissan car plant is one of the most productive car plants in the world. And it doesn't only depend, first of all, it's an inward investment, so it's an obvious beneficiary of the openness of the global economy. But secondly, those cars are being exported, they're not just being bought in the UK. So I think that, if you like, the worst thing for a car maker or anybody else would be a repeat of 1930s tariffs and other protectionist measures. That's a very hard argument to make, because in politics, the pain of open markets is short-term and evident, and the gain can often seem medium-term and widely spread. But I think that I'm very clear that if we will compound the crisis if we don't, if we succumb to protectionism. That's all the evidence of history.
I would like to come back for a moment to the point the colleague from the New York Times has made. Of course, when you have 20 countries together representing a large chunk of the world economy, then you get a certain degree of binding regulation. But there might be some smaller countries or islands known as under the summary tax haven or other ways that might be quite happy to be left out of this binding regulation and not taking part in this G20 framework. How do you reach out to them, or how do you try to enforce what will be agreed perhaps in London to those?
Interesting. I mean, we've thought more about outreach to countries with large populations but are relatively poor, rather than to the small countries with that might be quote-unquote tax havens. I think that this summit can set the norms for the global economy, and it sets the norms that are then put into legal practice by countries and policy practice by countries that then follow through. And you've got a very dynamic circumstance here, remember. You've got, in every country that's represented there, domestic response. We've just heard, just as I came out, the BBC says stimulus package passed in the US, confirmed in the US. So you've got major changes going on between now and April the 2nd. But you've got a recognition that there is an international dimension to it. The fact that you can't solve every problem and that not everyone is represented doesn't mean it's not worth solving the problems that you can. And I think that if you set global norms on the part of the most influential and powerful countries, you can do a lot to address issues. And I mean, I don't know if you've got something particularly in mind on the tax haven front, but I think that the financial regulatory issues, for example, through the Financial Stability Forum, those are big and substantial changes.
Some experts say that by including climate change issues, development issues, I mean, you've already talked about so many issues that is on the table. You will be taking your eye off the ball when the crisis, economic crisis, is so serious and you don't see the end to it. And by April, you still may not be seeing any end to it. So how would you convince, I mean, I suppose you'll be working towards April with the leaders of other countries. How would you be able to propose and convince that all these issues can be combined together and also bring concrete result? For example, would you be able to propose all the new economic stimulus package subsequent to the summit will include certain percentage of climate change, green package investment, or something really concrete that will show that it is a combined issue rather than many issues that, because you have only one day to work on it and 20 people, at least leaders, coming, and it seems there's a lot.
I think it's a really difficult issue, isn't it? Because on the one hand, comprehensiveness is essential because of the connections that exist between the trade agenda, the financial agenda, the macroeconomic coordination agenda, the resource agenda. But comprehensiveness can also be a vice because it means in the end you never have enough time on anything. I think the way out of that is that we have there's a spectrum of detail. In respect of the 47 tasks that people have been working on since November, you've got detailed 4 working groups working in detail. You're going to have far more granularity to the policy response than in some other areas. But I think that strong statements about open trade are important. Strong commitments are important. It's not the same as a detailed legal or technical instrument in respect of some aspect of financial regulation. So you've got a range of decisions and commitments, some detailed technical, others aspirational, others about how the leaders are going to take it forward. But I think that if we hadn't put on, if we'd restricted this to being a financial services, financial regulation conference, people would have rightly said that we were missing an essential aspect of the change since November, because it's evident this is an economic crisis, not just a financial crisis. And I do think the fact that its origins lie in the crunch of resources and a $147 a barrel oil price, not just a crunch of credit, is an important explanation. And the recessions that you're seeing around the world reflect that dual nature of the crunch. We've obviously got to be careful to get the right balance between ambition and realism. And I think the way through that is to recognise that in different of the spheres that we've raised, you will have a different degree of detail in the policy response. And that's inevitable. The other thing is this can't be the end of the process. This has got to be a process that's got momentum and drive going forward.
Mr. Foreign Secretary, you mentioned again that the stimulus bill has passed, and indeed it did, but the last time I looked, the stock market was down in the U.S., down very sharply. Is there a concern on your part that will be taken up during the summit that despite all that has been done, stimulus packages everywhere, that there is still a crisis of confidence and that governments, despite all they've done, the Prime Minister, your Prime Minister in particular, borrowing, taking on lots of risks, that there'll come a point where the economies are still collapsing and you have political unrest in a lot of surrounding economies around here, and then there'll come a point where something really, a serious decision on a global basis needs to be taken. And is this summit, do you see, given this timing, a place where really concrete steps can be taken?
Well,
as we're getting to a worse.
I mean, I certainly am not a believer that you should that you need to allow things to get even worse in order to produce a sort of equal and opposite reaction. But you're absolutely right that the steps that our Prime Minister set out in terms of recapitalisation of banking institutions and then refuelling the banking system, making sure that the economy holds up by giving confidence and stimulus to the economy. Those different steps are only now having their effect, and we don't know their full effect. And they're fighting against a global economy that is contracting. I was in Germany on Friday and Saturday. Germany faces a significant loss of GDP, but for different reasons than the UK. And so we're facing you can't say we're facing a unique set of challenges and then say, but we know that what we've already done is going to be enough. You've got to have the flexibility that allows you to do more.
What is the next step? I mean, sorry to interrupt, but if you come to a point where you really are sitting down next month and things are still bad.
I don't think anyone believes that everything's going to be bright and shining by April the 2nd or April the 3rd. What we've got is a process where governments are having to lead the response to a crisis that has a number of causes and that has corroded significantly confidence not just of consumers but of investors in the future. And it's government's job to restore confidence, not just by talking about it, but by concrete actions. Because in the end, this is going to have to be a recovery that is built on firm foundations. And in the end, that's what the markets are looking at, which you mentioned. And I think that the political response is very, very challenging, partly because the circumstances are unique, are different, but also to emphasize the global nature of this. And when our Prime Minister says that this is the first crisis of globalization, he's pointing to something that many people have talked about as in prospect, but have never really thought through how you respond to it. And I think that the fact that you're having to respond at a national level, a regional level, if you think about the European response, and an international level, is what makes this a particularly tricky sort of Rubik's Cube. What's interesting to me as a foreign policy, we're sitting in the Foreign Office, this institution is responsible for foreign policy. It's by definition dedicated to multilateralism. But multilateralism for this circumstance is having to be invented as we go along. And that makes it very, very challenging.
Just to stick on to this point, how much, in your feeling, has this preparation been hampered by sort of national jealousies, or the only thing that still is national in this international scale and globalized world are the political audiences in the countries that the national governments are responding to. So we have seen just recently within the French president announcing a European preparation summit, the German chancellor inviting all leading G20 members for Europe to Berlin, and of course there will be preparation work from the Prime Minister and from you as well. Could we have this easier?
I think that it's a bit like no one wants to see what the sausage machine actually looks like inside, but you can still like the sausages that come out at the end of it. I mean, what counts is the results, really, I think. And obviously, you and I look at this in contrast to colleagues around the table. We look at this from a European perspective, and we know that we're the world's largest single market, but we're 27 sovereign governments. And we have our own structures to try to bring coherence. I think that it was striking that in a way, come the crisis in September, October, the institutional rules were put to one side. The Eurozone met at heads of government level. Britain was invited, even though it's not a member of the Euro, and a coordinated response was brought into being. And I think that is a testimony to the severity of the challenge. In the end, a bit of politics is a bit of politics. I think that what the leaders recognised last autumn was that if they didn't pull together, they'd all be in trouble, and that's what they did. And I think you saw that then internationally with the first G20 meeting. You're now seeing it again. It's inevitable that not all the answers are found in one go or even a second go. But because confidence is so important and a sense of grip is so important, I think that this responsibility that they've taken on themselves is more than merited.
Could I just ask you the last question? And this comes from one of our use questioners, Rotherblog, who says, do you think capitalism has lost its way morally in causing the current crisis? And if so, what can the London summit do about that?
Well, capitalism has been an enormous source of wealth creation. But the truth is that there are different forms of the market economy all around the world. And some are more egalitarian, some are less. Some have a greater collective component, some have less. Some have stronger social security nets, others have less. And, of course, the other dimension is that now the morality is judged not just within individual countries but globally. And, therefore, one of the things that we say here is that global inequality is one of the greatest threats to stability. And we judge the sustainability and fairness of the system not just by its national components but by its international one. I think that we're having a big debate in Britain at the moment about bonuses. And people are using a language of morality or to be precise, immorality, about the way in which people are perceived to be paying themselves very, very large bonuses for failure rather than for success. And the entrails of that are being opened up rightly. Because if in fact you have a systemic incentive to reward yourself rather than to sustain the system, then you've got some serious problems. And I think that people are troubled by levels of inequality both within countries and between and around the world. And it's important, given the wealth-creating power of markets, that we don't succumb to the view that we can't therefore engage in serious debate about how to make it fairer and more secure. And I think that's an important responsibility in this regard.
Is it an advantage for Britain to be outside the currency zone or a disadvantage?
Well, we obviously concluded that it was an advantage to be outside when we decided not to join the euro when we did our assessment a few years ago. And look, the advantage of being outside the euro is that you've got a floating exchange rate, and that gives you a degree of flexibility. The government's position has always been that we don't see a constitutional or political bar to joining the euro, but the economic conditions have got to be right, and we haven't judged them to be so.
Sorry, Foreign Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.